Welcome to the debate on whether psychoanalysis is relevant to neuroscience. The center, jointly directed by me and Dave Chalmers, right down there, with the able assistance of John Simon, where is he? Right there, has had 10 previous debates on split brains, predictive coding, innateness in humans and in AI, unconscious perception, the replication crisis, the relation between neuroscience and art, mirror neurons, the neural basis of moral judgments, and cognitive penetration. So our debaters today are Mark Solms, who is chair of neuropsychology at the University of Capetown, president of the South African Psychoanalytic Association, and a founding editor of the journal Neuropsychoanalysis. Heather Berlin, who is an assistant professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York, and a visiting scholar at the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute. She has also been host of the PBS series Science Goes to the Movies, the international Discovery Channel series Superhuman Showdown, and Star Talk All-Stars with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Christina Albiruni is a professor of neuroscience in the Center for Neuroscience here at NYU. She's co-chair of the International Neuropsychoanalysis Society and editor-in-chief of the journal Hippocampus. Robert Stickgold is associate professor of psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School and the director of the Center for Sleep and Cognition. Each of our speakers will speak for 15 minutes. Then they will assemble on the stage. We will allow them extremely brief responses, after which they will take questions from the audience. So our intention here is to include two participants on each side of the question. Solms and Alberini on the positive side, psychoanalysis is relevant to neuroscience, and Berlin and Stickgold on the negative side. In setting the stage, I think it may help to briefly consider a corresponding question of the relevance of psychology to neuroscience. The contribution of opponent color channels to color vision was discovered in the early 20th century on the basis of introspective and behavioral data. This research guided the discovery of color opponent neurons in the visual cortex, and neural discoveries, such as the link between color, space, and form in double opponent cells, feeds back to and improves psychology. Another example, the discovery of the effects of attention on perception in psychology has guided the discovery of the mechanisms of this effect in the shifting and tuning of receptive fields in visual cortex, and that again feeds back to the psychology. In these cases, there are specific ideas from the psychology of perception that are relevant to the neuroscience of perception. I will be interested to hear whether there is a corresponding relevance of specific ideas in psychoanalysis in guiding brain research that then perhaps feed back to psychoanalysis itself. So anyway, I'll be listening carefully for that. And for our first speaker is Mark Solms.
Okay, thank you very much, Ned. I'm going to preface my brief presentation with this quotation from a wonderful book by Oliver Sacks called A Leg to Stand On, in which he reported from a subjective point of view his experience of a neurological disorder. He wrote, "Neuropsychology, like classical neurology, aims to be entirely objective, and its great power, its advances, come from just this. But a living creature, and especially a human being, is first and last active, a subject, not an object. It's precisely the subject, the living I, which is being excluded. Neuropsychology is admirable, but it excludes the psyche. It excludes the experiencing, active, living I." Hold that in the back of your mind as I say something about why psychoanalysis, the science of subjectivity, is relevant to neuroscience. I'm going to do this via a case study. I'm going to therefore talk to you about one single individual with one specific disorder of one particular mental function, namely memory. In particular, I don't see if this point is pointing. In particular, you're going to have to imagine where it's pointing. He has a disorder of episodic memory, that is to say, one of the aspects of declarative memory. And in particular, he has a confabulatory amnesia, also known as Korsakoff syndrome, arising from damage to the diencephalon, which you have to imagine I'm pointing at down there at the bottom left. So it's one particular case with one particular disorder of one particular function, and you're going to have to extrapolate from this case and function and disorder to neuroscience as a whole. The disorder, as I said, that he has is a confabulatory amnesia. The man is named E.S., and he had a meningioma growing off the olfactory sheath, pushing up on his optic nerves, which is how he became aware of it. And this was operated upon, and successfully the tumor was removed, but there was a small bleed during the operation, you see pointed out on the screen there, as a result of which he woke up with this terrible memory deficit. The essential features of a confabulatory amnesia are, first of all, of course, that it's an amnesia. That is to say, the patient is unable to lay down new memories. But the distinctive feature of this syndrome is that they're unaware that they're amnesic. And so rather than saying, I don't remember, when asked about recent events, they draw up memories which they think are veridical, whereas in fact they are mislocated in space and time, and frequently, in fact, are not memories at all, but rather fantasies or dreams or thoughts, which they take to be what has just happened. The standard cognitive neuroscience analysis of this disorder, confabulatory amnesia, is that it's a disorder of retrieval, and in particular, two aspects of the retrieval process. The first is a memory search process, that is to say, finding the memory that you're looking for. That is thought to be defective. And then secondly, once the memory, the wrong memory, is retrieved, there's a disorder of memory monitoring, so that they're not sufficiently critical of the memory that they've retrieved and take it, as I said, to be veridical. So this is the disorder that man suffers from, and this is the mechanism that we are told by cognitive neuroscience accounts for the disorder. What I want to do is tell you something about what I learned by studying this patient psychoanalytically. In fact, he was one of the very first patients that I saw. I was about 30 years old at the time. And I saw him, the referral from the neurosurgeon, who was, of course, aghast at how he woke up. The referral to me was, can you do something to reorientate him? So it was a clinical task. But at the same time, I was interested to see what could we, from a psychoanalytical point of view, in other words, from the point of view of taking the subjective observational perspective, what could we learn about this disorder that we didn't already know from purely cognitive methods? I need to tell you something about this patient as a person, because, of course, this is what psychoanalysis' perspective is all about. He was 56 years old. He was an electronic engineer, and these facts I need to tell you, you'll see why in a moment. He was remarried. He had previously been married to somebody named Denise, and now he was married to somebody named Val. He had a daughter with Val that he didn't know, didn't recognize her as being a child of his own. And two other facts I need to mention is that he had terrible troubles with his teeth, which had been successfully treated with implants, dental implants. And another minor medical fact is that he'd had a cardiac arrhythmia, which had been successfully treated with the insertion of a pacemaker device. You'll see in a moment why these facts are relevant. Now, I saw him every day at the same time, at the same place, but each day he didn't know that he'd seen me before. And he didn't know that he didn't know that he'd seen me before. So he always greeted me thinking I was so-and-so or so-and-so or so-and-so. All of them confabulations. Interestingly, there are certain themes. In a confabulatory amnesia, the patient doesn't just randomly say any old thing. That's the form of it, is that it's nonsense. But the content of it is quite interesting. And in this man's case, the themes that recurred were that he thought that I was a client of his, that I was in fact consulting him about an electronic problem that I had, bringing him some electronic matter that I needed him to repair or to advise me on. At other times, he thought we were both electronic engineers working on a problem together, a common problem, a common task. But another major theme was that he thought we were sporting pals, that in fact we had just played a game of rugby and were drinking a beer in the clubhouse, or that we had just been rowing together on the rowing team. These were in fact sports that he had participated in when he was a student. Him mistaking me for a fellow student was not that impossible. I was, as I said, only about 30 years old at the time, but he hadn't been a student for well over 30 years. So that's the context, and I'm now going to report to you what happened on the 10th session. I saw him 6 days a week, so this was the second week of my treatment of him. And on this particular occasion, I went down to the waiting room, and on greeting him, he touched the craniotomy scar on his head and looked at me and said, "Hi, Doc." So this was progress. Today, I was Doc, and I had something to do with the scar on his head. So on taking him to my consulting room, I tried to build on this progress, if that's what it was, and I said the following. I said, "You touched your head when we met in the waiting room." And he said, "I think the problem is that a cartridge is missing. We just need the specs." What was it? A C49? Should we order it? And I said, "What does a C49 cartridge do?" He said, "Memory. It's a memory cartridge, a memory implant." And that's when came to my mind the fact that he had these dental implants. He said, "But I never really understood it. In fact, I haven't used it for a good 5 or 6 months now. It seems we don't really need it. It was all chopped away by a doctor. What's his name? Dr. Solms, I think. But it seems I don't really need it. The implants work fine." Now here, there's a bit of a juggle. Sorry, I muddled these things up. This is what comes next. I said to him, "You're aware that something's wrong with your memory, but..." And he says, "Yes, it's not working 100%, but we don't really need it. It was just missing a few beats." And that made me think of the arrhythmia. The analysis showed that there was some C or CO9 missing. Denise, his previous wife, brought me here to see a doctor. What's his name again? Dr. Solms or something. And he did one of those heart transplant things. And now it's working fine. Never misses a beat. So I say again, you're aware that something's amiss. Some memories are missing, and of course that's worrying. You hope I can fix it, just like those other doctors fixed the problems with your teeth and your heart. But you want it so much that you're having difficulty accepting it's not fixed already. And he carries on, "Oh, I see, yes, it's not working 100%, and he touches his head. He says, "I got knocked on the head, went off the field for a few minutes, but it's fine now. I suppose I shouldn't go back on, but you know me, I don't like going down." So I asked Tim Noakes, who's a famous sports physician. He says, "So I asked Tim Noakes, because I've got the insurance, so why not use it? Why not go to the best?" And he said, "It's fine, play on." So that's my clinical vignette. I'm sure you can see from what I've just shown you the two cognitive deficits that I mentioned. The memory search problem, he's in roughly the right ballpark. He knows we're talking about heads. He knows we're talking about memory. He knows we're talking about doctors. He knows we're talking about operations, but he doesn't draw quite the right memory. That's the memory search deficit. In addition, you can see the memory monitoring deficit. When he retrieves these memories, he's not sufficiently critical as to whether they fit the bill or not. And I've already mentioned the outstanding example that he thinks we are sports pals together, whereas in fact he's 56 years old. Surely, this is not plausible. So this is what we see from a purely cognitive point of view. But from a psychoanalytic point of view, I hope you can see something more. When you take seriously the subjective perspective of the patient, and in particular their feelings, you see a very interesting additional dimension to this man's presentation. When he finds that that memory is missing, he says, "But you can order it. It's just a cartridge. All you need to do is order one." Very reassuring. Then not entirely sure that he's got that right. He says, "In fact, you don't need one. You don't need a memory. I find that I got on fine without one." Again, a self-reassurance. Talking about operations, he remembers he's had operations, and he's even touching his head, But please note the operations that he remembers were successful operations, where his teeth were successfully implanted, where his arrhythmia was successfully regulated with the pacemaker. What he does not remember is the very unreassuring fact that he's had a brain operation which went horribly wrong. Likewise, that there's a doctor involved. He mistakes me for other doctors. In particular, he mistakes, what comes to mind is the sports physician who says, it's fine, he can play on. When he notes there's something wrong with his head, please note it's something temporary. He just got biffed on the head and he's been sent off for a few minutes, but you know him, he doesn't like going down. And nobody less than Tim Noakes said that he can play on, it's fine. So what you see is that the affective dimension, put yourself in his shoes. It's just dawning on him. There's something wrong. I've got a hole in my head. There's a doctor here. I hope he's not the guy who botched this operation. I don't know what the hell's going on. I don't know what happened 2 minutes ago. Imagine what it feels like to be in such a situation. And I put it to you that these feelings played a part in the way that he retrieved only the happiest of memories. There's a tendentious, wishful tendency in his recall problem. It's not just a cognitive deficit. When you remove the veridical cognitive machinery, something else is released from inhibition, a much more affectively mediated modality or type of memory, something like the memory of a child. And so we learn something new about the mechanism of this disorder by taking seriously the subjectivity of the patient and the role of feelings in the cognitive machinery. Of course, you can't just use a clinical observation like that. I've told you this is just one patient. What we then did was we took the first 150 of his confabulations, gave them to blind raters, and said, is this more pleasant or less pleasant than the real situation? And what they found is, with massive significance, his memories are much more pleasant than the real situation. These are neutral or unpleasant memories that he retrieves, and these are the pleasant ones, compared to controls, to the misrememberings of controls. That's just one patient, then quantitatively confirming what we found in that case. Then we studied 10 cases, and we found exactly the same thing. A massive difference between the pleasant and the unpleasant or neutral confabulated memories compared to the memories of non-confabulating amnesics compared to those of healthy controls. So in this way, we then start to validate, using ordinary cognitive neuroscience techniques, that we have in fact found something new, the motivational, tendentious, wishful aspect of confabulatory amnesia. This teaches us something new about confabulatory amnesia, and thereby something new about the brain mechanisms which are faulty in this man's case. This is how an ordinary psychoanalytical perspective in a single case gradually led to us learning a whole lot new about confabulation. Here are the publications that ensued from those initial studies that I just told you about. Starting with Psychoanalytic Journal, Neuropsychoanalysis, we went to Neuropsychology, Brain and Cognition, Neurocase, Cortex, Cognitive Neuropsychiatry. So that's my shtick, that's my argument. I told you I'm speaking about only one example. You have to extrapolate from that. We did the same thing with anosognosia, for example, and we did the same thing with dreams, where Robert Stickgold and his teacher, Alan Hobson, got things so horribly wrong. Thanks very much.
Our next speaker is Heather Berlin.
Okay, so as a neuroscientist, I'm actually generally more sympathetic to psychoanalysis than most of my colleagues. I've collaborated with analysts in a number of ways, but I'm speaking on this side of the argument because the flow of the collaboration has been mostly just in one direction. Okay, so first I just want to start with what is psychoanalysis. So basically it's a theory of the mind and of mental illness and of treating mental illness. But it's important to remember that the theory was developed based on clinical observations. So neuroscientists use the scientific method. We study the brain and behavior directly, and we depart from the older psychoanalytic theories and instead explain the mental world and behavior in relation to neural processes. Now, Peter Fonagy, who's a very well-known psychoanalyst and researcher, has acknowledged that the evidence base for psychoanalysis is very thin. And in fact, he did a large research review, and found some support for psychodynamic therapy, but basically its efficacy was comparable to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is evidence-based. And it's also hard to determine whether the main effect is being driven by the particular therapy, or it's simply just the therapeutic alliance between the patient and the physician, regardless of the therapy. Also, all these studies were of short-term psychotherapy, and as far as I know, there's been no double-blind, placebo-controlled trials of long-term psychodynamic therapy. So, as I said, psychoanalysis is different. It might have clinical efficacy and value, but as a science needs to operationalize its hypotheses. It needs to test them with empirical methods and throw away constructs that fail to show that they have value. And psychoanalysis is based on anecdotal clinical case studies, not using the scientific method. So going a little bit further, let's just look at some data. So this is a graph that represents all the search terms, putting in the term psychoanalysis and the term cognitive psychology into PubMed. And as you can see, as cognitive psychology publications increased, psychoanalytic publications remain pretty constant. Now you can say, well, they publish in different kinds of journals, perhaps, but even with this caveat, it's clear that psychoanalysis hasn't really gained a significant foothold in mainstream analytic science. So we can use the tools of neuroscience to explore the veracity of psychoanalytic concepts, but we can't really use the tools of psychoanalysis to verify neuroscience. And sometimes findings in neuroscience overlap with ideas in psychoanalytic theory and reinforce or justify those concepts, but the psychoanalytic ideas themselves aren't needed to conduct the neuroscience research or to better understand how the physical brain works. Now, whatever the limitations, psychoanalysis, as I said, has some clinical value, and it's really had an important legacy in psychiatry, and a whole generation of psychiatrists have learned to really listen to their patients, to listen to their histories, and I think that's really important. And I'm a proponent of investigating psychoanalytic concepts, like I did in this paper, from a neuroscientific perspective. And here what I did was basically review findings in neuroscience and cognitive psychology that overlap with some concepts in psychoanalysis, like repression, suppression, dissociation. But the thing is, the researchers in these studies did their work independently of psychoanalysis. So it was an act of me basically retrofitting neuroscience findings to validate some of the core concepts of psychoanalytic theory. Now, I'm a member of the Society of Neuropsychoanalysis. Mark Solms is the founder, and one of its aims is basically to use neuroscientific findings to confirm some analytic theories or see where they overlap. But claims that neuroscience studies validate Freud's model of the unconscious are based on cherry-picking the data, kind of like what I admittedly did. And that makes neuroscience relevant to psychoanalysis, but not vice versa. And it also goes both ways. Analysts can go on with business as usual without neuroscience, right? And some, in fact, say that to try to incorporate neuroscience into their practice would be problematic. They don't want to dilute the clinical methods or Freud's theories with neuroscientific data. It just doesn't, it's irrelevant to some of their psychoanalytic predictions. So both disciplines can function independently of each other, but sometimes findings in neuroscience are used to support psychoanalytic theories. Like, for example, in Mark's paper in 2013, he used neuroscientific data to suggest that the upper brainstem is intrinsically conscious and the cortex is not. And he said himself, these facts have substantial implications for psychoanalytic metapsychology. So basically, this could mean that the id then is the source of consciousness and the ego in itself is not conscious. But the point here is that, again, he's using neuroscientific data to try to have implications in psychoanalytic theory, but not vice versa. And I argued in my response to this paper, based on decades of neuroscientific evidence, why this radical idea is incorrect. But I won't get into the details now. We've debated on that topic before. But the point here is that his suggested changes to psychoanalytic theory don't impact the the findings of neuroscience. He's using neuroscience to try to support an evolving psychoanalytic theory. Now, psychoanalysis can also sometimes be used as an analogy, and I admittedly do this, where we describe brain processes that we've discovered via the scientific method in psychoanalytic terms because to make them more comprehensible to a public that's used to terms like, he's so anal or Freudian slip, right? So, for instance, we'll say the ego is like the subcortical parts of the brain here that are sensitive to immediate pleasure or avoidance of pain. We'll call that the id forces. And sometimes we'll say, and these prefrontal cortex areas that are involved in thinking about future consequences of your actions and inhibiting your behavior is like the superego. And so, again, these terms are like early definitions of things that have evolved as the science has evolved. And it's similar to like the early days of psychiatry or medicine when we used to talk about élan vital or life force or the humors, if you recall. We used to explain psychiatric illness by saying, for example, like melancholia or depression was having too much black bile in the body. And now it was a good way to describe personality and emotion at the time until we understood the science. It was kind of like a placeholder. And neuroscientific data can be framed in psychoanalytic terms, but we just can easily use psychological or cognitive terms to frame our data as well. So again, we don't need psychoanalysis per se. Now, Eric Kandel, he didn't need to put a plegia on a couch to understand the neural mechanism of memory formation, right? He won the Nobel Prize on his research on the physiologic basis of memory. And he may have been inspired by psychoanalysis to investigate how memory works. But upon the advice of his mentor, he said, you should pursue a reductionist approach to studying the nervous system, which he did, and it was independent of psychoanalytic theory. Just like some scientists might be inspired by the humanities, but that doesn't impact their data. It's also important to remember that Freud, one of the founders of the field of psychoanalysis, based his theory on observation mostly of wealthy Austrian women and not placebo-controlled trials. His work isn't evidence-based. And Freud's model was really was sort of framed by the male-dominated culture of his time. His model of the mind and child development has been challenged and refuted by many. And based on this, some have tried to update psychoanalytic theory and revise it. But almost everybody falls into the same trap as Freud in that they base their theory on clinical experience, not on replicable scientific data, with the exception of attachment theory, which does have some scientific backing. So again, he was influenced by this male-dominated culture and by his own male perspective. So let's take penis envy, for example. Which he called the female counterpart to castration anxiety in males. And he basically said that girls in the phallic stage between 3 and 5 years old, she realizes she has no penis, and so she distanced herself from her mother and then devotes her affections to her father. Now, female psychoanalysts at the time, like Karen Horney, thought that these ideas were completely distorted and condescending, and she even suggested it's the men who are adversely affected by their inability to have children, which she called womb envy. Now, Freud's response was, and I quote, "We shall not be very greatly surprised if a woman analyst who has not been sufficiently convinced of the intensity of her own wish for a penis also fails to attach proper importance to that fact in her patients." So again, this statement and others like it show the unfalsifiability in principle of psychoanalysis. You can't argue against it. And, could we ever test penis envy from a neuroscience? Is there a mouse model of penis envy? I don't know. And what about hysteria? I mean, hysteria was thought to be symptoms like partial paralysis, hallucinations, nervousness. It was originated by the Greek physician Hippocrates, when he basically thought a woman's womb was moving throughout her body. Now, hysteria is not a valid diagnosis now, but it's a good example of how concepts can emerge, change, and be replaced when we gain greater understanding of how humans think and behave. And it's also important to remember that Freud didn't come up with the term unconscious. It existed well before Freud. William James wrote about it in his famous Principles of Psychology. He examined the way Schopenhauer, Van Hartman, Genet, Binet, and others used this term. Okay, I'm good on time. Great. So I think many mysteries of the mind can be understood and revealed when we look to the disordered mind for answers and integrate that information with results from animal studies, genetics, imaging studies. And Freud was prescient to look to the brain for answers. In fact, here, this is his sketch of what he thought the neural basis of repression was. But his efforts at the time were limited by the mechanistic understanding and the technologies that were available at the time. So he just filled in the blank with placeholders. Now, psychoanalysis is a particular framework for understanding the mind, but some analysts admit they need a new framework, and they're trying to redefine the field and be open to revision. I recently spoke at the International Psychoanalysis Symposium, and Terry Rogers, who's a professor, colleague of mine in Mount Sinai, said we need to create a new model of the mind. We don't treat complex systems as energy models anymore, as Freud did when he talked about cathexis. We have a signaling network. It's always on. Thinking perturbs it. There's no need for free energy. So why should psychoanalysis be the model of the mind, right? When studying the neural basis of the mind and consciousness, neuroscientists are more likely to see links to psychology and cognitive science rather than psychoanalysis as a framework. So the question is not should psychoanalysis be relevant to neuroscience? There may be valid arguments to suggest that it should be, which I'm open to hearing. But the question is it relevant to neuroscience? So let's look at the data. This is a PubMed search that I did of all of the main journals in neuroscience. And there, if you just look at how many publications, the articles there are in the Journal of Neuroscience, in the Journal of Neuroscience, Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, you get over 63,000 papers. Then I took all those journals and then did a search term that could be in any field, the term psychology in any of these journals. You get about 8,000 papers. It's 12% of the journals. Then I used the term cognitive psychology. Okay, you get a little bit less, about just over 4%. Then I typed in the term psychoanalysis in any of these journals, and there was one paper, one. So the data implies that psychoanalysis is not relevant to neuroscience. Most neuroscientists are not interested in psychoanalysis, and it doesn't really impact their research. It's not to say it's again, has clinical value in understanding how a person thinks and behaves, but it doesn't mean that that is the framework that neuroscientists should use when trying to understand the mind and how it relates to the brain. So in sum, neuroscience findings could all have been independently discovered without the predictions of psychoanalysis. In fact, most were. Some research avenues have been suggested by a psychoanalytic framework, but those convergences can't be claimed as victories unless you also take into account all of the psychoanalytic predictions that neuroscience and experimental psychology have not found evidence for. So neuroscience, I think, has the potential to offer powerful corroborations of some psychoanalytic concepts, and I'm a proponent of that, as long as the disconfirmations are accepted with equal humility. So psychoanalysis may be a useful clinical tool that looks towards neuroscience for validation, but neuroscience does not need psychoanalysis to validate it or give context to its findings. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Christina Albiruni. Let's put this in here.
Good evening, everyone. Meanwhile, that we are switching computer, if I can help you, I'd like to thank the organizers of this debate. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to be close to the mic. Thank you so much for organizing this interesting debate, and I am in a lot of agreements with Heather, actually, for a number of points that she made. But I am actually a living example of how psychoanalysis inspired my neuroscience in the lab. So first, I'm going to make a couple of points. And I start with the question of how is psychoanalysis relevant to neuroscience? Because for me, it's clearly, because for me, clearly the answer is, it is. I can do that. Okay. The fact that whether or not it's relevant for me is not a question. It is relevant. And the reason why I'm saying that is actually I have been working in neuroscience, in neurobiology, so I work with genes and molecules to try to understand the molecular basis of long-term memory. So I trained with Eric Kandel, come from the same type of questions, and continue to do so. But then at one point I trained in psychoanalysis. And for some Freudian reason, that was not in my resume. But I did train in psychoanalysis. I am a licensed psychoanalyst in the New York State. And so I went through the material of training in psychoanalysis. And I can say that I had a number of frustration as a scientist to see the lack of scientific basis. However, the richness of the clinical material, the richness of the theories that I learned inspired some of the questions that I then asked in my lab. And I'm going to give you the example in a minute. So why and how is psychoanalysis relevant to neuroscience? To formulate and test hypotheses about mechanisms of mental processes and mental health in a way that psychoanalysis can enrich. So I believe that this different angle of consideration of mental processes is the premise to innovative ideas and new research projects. Psychoanalysis is very rich in clinical material, in understanding human behavioral responses, in individual responses, their regulation, and importantly, the repetition in maladaptive conditions and through an unconscious mode. Unconscious is a very interesting and you can experience, if you train in psychoanalysis, you see it, of course, in yourself, but when you work with patients. And that, to me, was one of the most interesting process that I have seen repeatedly. So I became interested, of course, in a number of questions. And as I mentioned, although psychoanalysis has been kept distant from scientific evaluation, it provides a different view of the mind. For example, it is clear that all basic principles of psychoanalytic theories and clinical observation from this, that most neuropsychiatric maladaptive behavior are produced or strongly influenced by responses to emotions, motivations, we can say, which are deeply rooted in the history of the individual. And this is very much coming from the psychoanalytic knowledge. This is not how neuroscience or psychiatry think about behavior and brain disorders. They come from a different angle. They ask questions from a very different angle. In psychiatry, and therefore in neuroscience-based models, psychiatric diseases are classified on the basis of screening for symptoms. But many symptoms are common to several different psychiatric diseases. This is the description of depression, major depression disorder. As it is described in the DSM-5, is based on a number of symptoms. I'm not going to read them all. But the same symptoms are also common to other disorders. For example, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia and personality disorder. So how then are specific disorders understood, studied, and treated? There is the need to identify novel hypotheses and different way of thinking to have better model to study diseases as well as models of mental functions. So classifying the diseases based on symptoms will not likely provide information about the cause. And this is what I have found in my training in thinking about more through the psychoanalytic readings and understanding and work with patients. So Freud has used the knowledge of the patient's symptoms to propose models of mental processes or psychic apparatuses. I'm not saying they are all correct, but I'm saying that the contribution of that to our studies are extremely important, and they can enrich our ideas and thinking about novel models and questions. So the diagnosis of diseases came from all this knowledge for Freud. and there is no doubt that he was thinking in an innovative way at his time, hypothesized novel mechanism or model of mental functions and pathologies. This knowledge is a very rich source of information that can inspire novel hypotheses and research models. So my interest, as I mentioned, is to understand the biological basis of long-term memory. Of course, we want to go through all the processes of memory, encoding, storage, retrieval, modification, and the use of the resulting knowledge from these studies to identify approaches for treatment that can improve memory disorders and also memories in normal conditions. So I was inspired by Freud during my training because I didn't realize through my training in neuroscience how important it is to think about development and how long-term memories are so influenced by the history of the individual. So if we want to study memory processes in an adult animal, I'm using rodents in the lab, we ask a question that is right there and in that moment. But we ignore, as neuroscientists, the history that the animal undergoes. And of course, in the lab, the history is very limited because we limit the history of each individual animal. But it is a very important concept that certainly influenced my type of question. So Freud, for example, says that in infancy there is virtually no organization of memory or experience, and frustration or delays of a balanced development can cause a violent all or none reaction. If frustration is of a traumatic intensity or prolonged, the child personality will develop specific traits. And here we go into personality traits. In many cases, he postulated that development along certain lines can be arrested at a given stage. All these concepts were interesting to me. And although there are several studies showing that early developmental experience can create long-lasting alteration and promote psychopathology, the biological mechanism by which brain function, including learning and memory that we are studying in the lab, develop and shape over developmental stages remains not understood, not known. So to translate the concept proposed by Freud in my experimental plan, I decided to study the biological mechanism of memory formation during early development. And the type of memories we are studying are the medial temporal lobe dependent memories, episodic type. So Mark gave an introduction to the memory systems. And episodic memories in humans about people and things and places, everything that is bound together in an episodic experience. And the same medial temporal lobe, which is present in rodents, processes very similar type of information, episodic memories. Memories about who, conspecific, what, where, and when, and bind all these elements together. So we can use rodents to study episodic memories, the biological basis of it. And from Freud, we know, and a lot of material from Freud says that experiences in early years of our childhood leave ineradicable traces in the depth of our mind. So this led to the first explanation of infantile amnesia, which although Freud was not the first to describe it, he was the first to give an explanation. And we're going to get to that in a minute. Infantile amnesia is the fact that as adults, we don't recall the memories of experiences we had in the first few years of life, say in the first 3 years. Yet, we had a lot of episodic experiences at that age, and we have no recollection. So there is a paradox. How is that these early memories that influence our life forever are forgotten? We need to understand what the phenomenon is. And this has been described in humans, 5 minutes, and has been associated to a very rapid forgetting. So memories are formed in the children, but they are rapidly forgotten. And this rapid forgetting happens also in rodents. So we use rats and mice to study our hypothesis about infantile memories. And several hypotheses have been proposed to explain infantile amnesia. Freud said, the infantile amnesia, is due to the conflict and the repression of infantile memories because of their disturbing sexual content. Cognitive science says infantile amnesia is because of lack of language skills or sense of self. But this rapid forgetting is not only happening in humans, it happens also in non-human animals, in rodents. So we need a neurobiological explanation for it. And a couple of hypotheses have been put forward. One is that the hippocampus is immature and therefore unable to consolidate episodic memories at that age. And these are grouped as developmental hypotheses. And then there is another group of hypotheses that says, no, the memories are stored, but they cannot be recalled. And I'm going to make this story short because the studies are published. But we reproduce the infantile amnesia in our rats, giving an episodic memory. They enter into a place, they get a food shock, they remember that place and they avoid it. And when we start to look at memories immediately after the event, at different age, we start from the same level of performance, but the very young, the infant rats, lose the memory very, very rapidly compared to the other groups that are older. One in the black is the adult, and in the orange is a little older, when they can store long-term memories. But what happened is that this rapid forgetting is actually not a total forgetting, because when we give reminders later in life, we see that this memory returns. They come back, they are specific, and they are long-lasting. So we found, starting from an hypothesis that was inspired by psychoanalysis, something that was not otherwise, in my mind, to be tested. So we determined that the hippocampus is required to store these infantile latent memories. We identified the biological mechanisms in the hippocampus that are activated, that are regulated by the learning event, and are required to store these latent memory traces. And what we found is that these mechanisms are biological mechanisms typical of critical periods. And critical periods are developmental phases in life during which the brain responds very highly and in a very peculiar way to experience. They have been studied in sensory systems, as you know. So we found that the same type of mechanism are used in the hippocampal dependent memory system. So we concluded that early in development, the hippocampus undergoes a critical period, very much like sensory systems do. We have a number of evidence, of course. I'm happy to share if you're interested. And during this critical period, the hippocampus is maturing in response to experience. So it's shaping in response to the experience that the individual encounters. So this has a lot of implications, clearly. Implications in how we develop as a single individual, in a number of questions that have to do with pathological states and neurodevelopmental disorders that we can get into. This is a little bit of a representation of the model. We think the critical periods are starting, of course, very early with the most simple functions that undergo the first critical periods and that enable a second critical period that is more complex, and that enable another critical period until the complex functions are fully developed. So in conclusion, I have experimented how the knowledge provided by psychoanalysis can be useful to inspire novel questions and approach designs in the field of neuroscience. Thanks.
So the last of our speakers is Robert Stickgold.
So, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to say, by the way, as to my introduction, I am no longer an associate professor. As of Wednesday, I'm a full professor. So this week can't go all bad for me. I'm going to talk about the relevance of relevance to neuroscience, because I was struck by the title of this, this debate that they don't ask, is psychoanalysis useful to neuroscience? They don't ask, does psychoanalysis provide important insights to neuroscience? They ask, is it relevant? So what does that mean? How can we measure relevance to neuroscience? First of all, anything that describes or claims to describe any aspect of behavior, the nervous system, the brain, neurons, or even calcium channels is relevant to neuroscience because that's what neuroscience studies. So we can say, yes, psychoanalysis is relevant to neuroscience. But the question is, does it offer anything of value to it? That's the real question. Can neuroscience gain from what psychoanalysis has to offer? And to try to give you a sense of how this works, I want to take a comparison and ask the question, is creationism valuable to evolutionary biology? Supporters of creationism, a clear pseudoscience, have argued in some... Come on. I sat quietly while Mark dissed me in his talk. They've argued, in some cases successfully, for its inclusion in biology textbooks that discuss evolution. So it's relevant to evolutionary biology. That's the problem with the use of that word, although it offers nothing of value to it. So how can we talk about, is psychoanalysis relevant to neuroscience? Well, Heather showed this data also. We came up with this together. It's the idea of looking at sort of the H index for these different disciplines by looking at how frequently they appear in journals. And creationism, interestingly, appears in about 1 out of every 950, 1 in 1,000 articles in journals of evolutionary biologies. And that's compared to the number Heather gave for psychoanalysis. I don't know, can you see it down there? There's a little thing down there. If we want to see that, we have to magnify the scale. So let's up the scale by tenfold. Now that red bar actually goes up to the 5th floor of this building. And now you can see that psychoanalysis is about, as she commented, 1 in 64,000 publications. And so, and that's compared, by the way, to acetylcholine, which appears in 3.5% of all articles in the neuroscience journals. So it's not just that nothing gets many hits. So based on citations in relevant journals, creationism is 50 to 100 times more relevant to evolutionary biology than psychoanalysis is to neuroscience. Or to be a little more fair, evolutionary biologists consider creationism that much more relevant to their work than neuroscientists consider psychoanalysis to theirs. That's how much they talk about it in each of those two disciplines. So what other ways can we look and try to argue for this relevance of psychoanalysis to neuroscience? Well, it could be that there are experimental findings from psychoanalysis that impact directly on neuroscience and demands that neuroscience pays attention to it. But we've heard this from all the speakers, I think, that there just aren't a lot of experimental findings in psychoanalysis at that level of description. There could be new methodologies. Psychoanalysis could come up with techniques that neuroscientists embrace as being useful for their studies of neuroscience. And that's not just something that can't happen. I mean, it doesn't happen. But if I looked at the numbers, I've got them here, it turns out that in neuroscience, 8% of the papers in neuroscience refer to brain imaging techniques that were developed in other fields other than neuroscience. So physics and imaging methodologies coming from outside of neuroscience have had a huge impact on the way neuroscientists even think about what they do, and they use these methods. Or there could be conceptual frameworks. So psychoanalysis can offer conceptual frameworks. And these can either come with experimental support, which again they don't, or they can come without experimental support. And that's in fact what we see. We see conceptual frameworks without experimental support, and that's not good. I mean, we talked about conceptual frameworks like penis envy, which is Penisneid, if you want the Freudian German of it. And I was thinking about Heather's comments and her reading from Freud, right? His response to the female psychoanalyst. And I was thinking, you know, Freud could get an appointment in the Trump administration. I mean, it was that bad. So what else did they offer? What else do they offer? You have the ego, the id, and the superego as concepts. It proposes 3 distinct and separable divisions of the mind, which is interesting to neuroscientists. It suggests a division that they're functionally independent, they function independently, which would be of interest in neuroscience. And in fact, we see that in research on dissociative identity disorders, which seem to carry this concept of separate identity, separate consciousness coexisting within a brain, but always without reference to psychoanalysis. There's the Freudian, the cognitive, and the Überwuss. No, that's wrong. I forget the German. Unconscious. So there's these 3 different unconsciouses. Is that a word? And that would be of interest to neuroscience also. But it turns out that we're not interested. And the reason is because none of these concepts are defined in a scientific, disprovable form that allows us to rigorously evaluate them, even in neuroscientific terms. It's lacking in scientific evidence of their existence, which makes us very unlikely to want to get involved in studying them. And it's similar to the problem for studying consciousness, but it's been overcome in consciousness studies, which are embraced by neurosciences, because there are at least subjective methods of identifying the presence of consciousness. Now, a 4th possibility would be Freudian dream theory, and Mark brought it up, so I will use it as a case study. In his 1997 book, The Neuropsychology of Dreams, Mark attacked Alan Hobson's activation synthesis model, concluding that, quote, dreams are not initiated by the brainstem mechanisms that initiate REM sleep. Instead, he said that based on his brain lesion studies, that dreams depended on frontal dopaminergic circuits, what he called appetitive interest, and you can read as wish fulfillment circuits, without whose activation dreaming will not ensue. So that's what he put forward there. And then, it's striking that Solms was meticulous in his book in not suggesting that this hypothesis was informed by psychoanalytic theory. In fact, neither psychoanalysis nor Freud appears in the book's extensive index. So even he, when he drifts more towards the neuroscientific world, almost disavows his psychoanalytic and Freudian background. Solms revisited this topic in a 2012 paper led by Susan and Malcolm Smith entitled Approach Avoidance in Dreams. This was in response to the threat stimulation theory of dreaming that had been proposed a dozen years earlier by Antti Revonsuo in Finland. The TST model proposes that dreaming provides a virtual environment in which biologically threatening situations can be safely rehearsed. This is consistent, Malcolm Smith points out, with the fact that the amygdala is highly activated during REM sleep. But she goes on to point out, during dreaming sleep, the entire limbic system is activated. So whereas we appear to have gotten it wrong, Mark, it looks like you're now proposing that REM sleep equals dreaming, and that you're looking at REM sleep to justify, on a neuroscientific basis, this idea that threat simulation theory is wrong. But they did more. They actually ran an experiment. They analyzed dream reports collected from 210 college students using what's known as the most recent dream technique, where you just take students in a class, give them a sheet of paper and say, write down the most recent dream you can remember. And then they had judges classify each of these as either showing approach behavior or avoidance behavior. And they found that almost 3 times as many approach dreams as avoidance dreams, and concluded that the results supported that the hypothesis that dreams represent reward-seeking activity, wish fulfillment, rather than threat avoidance. And there should be a close quote there. But again, no mention of Freud or psychoanalysis can be found in the paper. So 2 problems exist in this paper. First, they suggest that the approach dreams are a consequence of the activation of dopaminergic pathways during sleep. That's not a problem, but they then go on to argue that even the avoidance dreams reflect dopaminergic activation, noting that dopamine agonists not only enhance dream frequency and intensity, but also increase nightmares. So now we're in this unpleasant situations where all dreams reflect dopaminergic action, and the falsifiability of the hypothesis evaporates. Now, the second problem is that he ignored a paper of mine, a grievous narcissistic injury, published in 2005, 7 years before Marx's paper, that showed that, and I'm quoting from the abstract, aggressive social interactions were more characteristic of REM than non-REM, while dreamer-initiated friendliness was more characteristic of non-REM than REM reports. So the 3-to-1 ratio of approach to avoidant behavior in the Malcolm Smith article may simply reflect a 3-to-1 ratio of REM to non-REM awakenings preceding the dream recollection and the reports in his paper. In any case, by failing to collect the sleep data, which neuroscientists would almost definitely have done, their study became uninformative to neuroscience. It had no neuroscience in it. How might psychoanalysis become relevant? To drop out of the hostile mood, as a neuroscientist, I have to say I honestly don't understand why we're talking about Freud at all. When we discuss chemical transmission at neuronal synapses, we don't quote verse and chapter from the writings of Otto Loewi, who won the Nobel Prize for his proof of the existence of such synapses. Nor do we constantly refer to it as vagus stuff, which is the word that Loewi invented to describe this unknown chemical substance. We call it acetylcholine, which is what it turned out to be, and we talk about it without any reference to Loewi's experiments of 50 to 100 years earlier. If psychoanalysis is to become truly relevant to neuroscience, there's 4 things it has to do. It has to stop referring to Freud and using his arguments to justify psychoanalytic concepts. What Freud thought 100 years ago is irrelevant to scientific investigations today. Operationalize. You have to operationalize psychoanalytic concepts with scientific, disprovable definitions. And you have to derive new neuroscientific questions from these psychoanalytic concepts and test them. So in conclusion, while neuroscience is clearly relevant to psychoanalysis and can inform psychoanalytic theory, the opposite is not true. At this point, psychoanalysis offers no help to neuroscientists seeking to understand the brain and the mind, and it's not meaningfully relevant. Thank you. I'll sit next to Mark, sure. I'm a brave soul.
Want to move down one more?
Well,
Oh, no,
you
he's
got
good.
5.
Okay, we go.
Okay, so any of you want to make any brief remark about the others' talks?
I'm not sure about the format, Ned, because, I mean, there are many specific points which I could respond to, but I'm not sure if you want us to do
Maybe
it
the
that way.
best thing is just to get questions from the audience. No. Okay, go ahead.
Give us
need a
each 3
pen.
minutes. How's that?
How about
1 minute.
No, 3 minutes. Okay, so
Oh my God.
I'll shoot, starting with Heather, and you'll just stop me. I mean, I've got more than 3 minutes worth. Heather's main point was that, or one of her main, was that the relevance is unidirectional, only from neuroscience to psychoanalysis, not in the other direction. Unfortunately, she wrote her talk before she heard mine, where she says that the evidence for psychoanalytical treatment is not there, but then she also says it's equally efficient to CBT, which is in fact what the evidence shows. CBT, the evidence-based treatment, is as effective as psychoanalytic treatment. But then she says that's short-term psychotherapy, which is of course true. And then she says, which is truncated. We don't believe in short-term psychotherapy in psychoanalysis. Then she says there's no randomized controlled trials of psychoanalysis, which is not true. There's a meta-analysis by DeMart et al. 2014, which shows how much more effective is psychoanalysis than short-term psychotherapy. The most recent study by Marianne Leutzinger-Berleber after the DeMart review showed an incredible effect size of 1.6 for psychoanalysis, and that's just measured by behavioral, symptom checklists, which is not the way that we measure change. The measure of structural change, that is to say personality change, was just off the charts and way, way higher than CBT. So the evidence is there if one wants to find it. She says that we cherry pick from neuroscientific findings in order to validate psychoanalytic or Freudian concepts. But in the very same presentation, she points out that in my conscious id, I invalidated one of the most fundamental of psychoanalytical claims using neuroscientific data. So it's not true that we cherry pick. She says that there's relevance of neuroscience to psychoanalysis, but it doesn't make any difference to what we actually do clinically. Well, I debated on that topic in 2008, and I'm happy to say that an assembled audience of psychoanalysts said that neuroscience is relevant to what they do clinically by a margin of 2 to 1. She said that these early definitions, things like ego and id, are not relevant to neuroscience. They refer to things which we've replaced by better terms, and makes the analogy to humors from Galen. But in fact, I think that there are many psychoanalytical terms which should be used in neuroscience because they refer to things which are completely neglected in neuroscience. And I think this is the main point, that the whole motivated, affectively driven nature of the active living life of the mind, is missing in neuroscience, as Cristina so eloquently put it in her presentation. So it's not true that only that psychoanalytic concepts are missing in neuroscience. I really do accept that they are, but I think it's very much to the detriment of neuroscience that the things that are covered by that are the concepts of vehicles for aspects of mental life, which are woefully neglected in neuroscience. Shall I carry on?
No, that's 3 minutes.
Oh, there's so much. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So Freud was a man who came up with these ideas, which carried on, and it's almost cited like scripture, right? Freud said this, without validation. And the things that become validated, let's say and these placebo controlled studies that you talk about, I'm not aware of them, if they're double-blind placebo-controlled trials. But the studies that overwhelmingly that I have seen in terms of psychoanalysis and its efficacy, rarely compare it to other therapies. But when they do, and as I said, there is similar efficacy, at least in Fonagy's literature review, to CBT. But we don't know, and also to other kinds of therapies, but we don't know, again, is it the therapy itself that's having the effect, or simply the therapeutic alliance in that you're having a relationship with another human being, and there's a lot of positive aspects to that. So again, we don't know that it's specific to the techniques of psychoanalysis that's having the effect outside of other aspects of talk therapy. And in terms of like the cherry picking, if just like you said, you can then flip it on its head and now change it and say, okay, the ego is unconscious and the id is conscious, and you're basing that on neuroscientific data. But again, how much do we is there a research agenda that you say, okay, these are the terms in psychoanalysis, this is how we're going to actually test them, rather than taking neuroscientific data, retrofitting it onto the theory as you see fit, and sometimes changing the theory if the neuroscientific data doesn't map onto it nicely. And it just feels like no matter what, you have this theory that you're trying to mold and change and make it all fit together, whereas it doesn't work in the opposite direction, where you have this and you're trying to say, test it with the neuroscientific evidence. I don't know. I can go on. I don't know if that addresses everything. Yeah.
So, Christina or Bob, do you want to?
Yeah, only briefly, a couple of points. So I think the number of publications showing that there is no term psychoanalysis in it, it's not a valid argument. I'll tell you that all my papers that have been inspired by psychoanalysis don't have the word psychoanalysis in it. And I publish in neuroscience journals. The reason why is that the field of trying to figure out what is important that the two can merge in advancing a new field together is not there. So if I use the word psychoanalysis, it's not pertinent to my papers, and that's why it's not in there. So that is really not an argument. And the fact that neuroscientists do not use or do not ask questions based on psychoanalysis is simply because they are not trained in it. They really don't know. If we create some new discipline in which the training include both, I'll bet that there's going to be a different type of questions, a different type of experimental design, and therefore validation of some of the questions that are going to be tested.
Can I just respond to that? There's a whole field of studying unconscious processes in the brain, and things like, I'm a neuroscientist who's not a psychoanalyst, but I've read extensively about the theories, and I'm interested in unconscious processes in the brain. And I think some of it is interesting and relevant, like I'm interested in suppression and repression and dissociation. But again, that's picking a couple of things that Freud stumbled upon amongst a sea of other things that it seemed to everyone just like, oh yeah, that was just, Freud being a little crazy at that point. We're not going to pay attention to that, but we're going to pay attention. I mean, there's a lot of things. I've read mostly all of Freud, and there are things where it's pretty out there, but a lot of people don't focus on that. It's just, oh, these are the things he got right, and I give him that. But there's a whole field. It's not like neuroscientists are ignorant to concepts in psychoanalysis. They're just not that relevant to what we're doing.
I disagree.
Yeah. So a number of points. Mark, I really liked your presentation, and I really liked how you showed that listening to patients gives you a better understanding of the underlying pathology of people with these confabulatory amnesias. But any kind of listening therapy could have done that. Any talk therapist worth her weight would have been able to see these same things. I didn't hear anything in your talk that referred to psychoanalytic concepts being used to mediate your understanding of her condition. Christina, I accept, and I was struck by the fact that your research has been inspired by psychoanalysis. And so I would say, yes, psychoanalysis can be used that way. But lots of other things can, too. I mean, Otto Loewi, who I mentioned, got his inspiration for his Nobel laureate, Nobel Prize-winning experiment from a dream. So we can get inspirations from our dreams. We can get them from plays. We can get them from novels. Long Day's Journey into Night.
But I got them from psychoanalysis.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Yes, and I accept
That's
that.
an N of one.
Well, no, but there's probably more. But the point is that, I mean, Long Day's Journey into Night is a beautiful depiction of an iatrogenically induced codependent drug addiction problem, which, could have led researchers to ask, why does this happen? And we can get inputs from all sorts. So in that way, psychoanalysis can be relevant in the same way that dreams and plays and novels are, but it's not a special type of relevance. And I just want to make a comment that we don't, in fact, ignore childhood and development. When we talk about PTSD in neuroscience, we talk a lot about the effect of early childhood trauma and its impact on brain structure and cortisol levels early in life and the impact on cortisol levels later in life. I mean, we do all of that without reference to psychoanalysis. I think in the end that psychoanalysis can be used as an insight tool, but truly it doesn't have a privileged place in doing that.
Okay, let's open it up to questions. Boy, we have a lot of questions here. Dave?
And please wait to ask your question until you've actually got the mic right in front of you so that we can record it.
Thanks. This is really interesting and enlightening. I was wondering whether maybe we set the bar a little bit too high with, is psychoanalysis relevant to neuroscience? You know, there's a pretty large distance between those two disciplines, and you might think, okay, psychoanalysis doesn't have to be relevant to neuroscience, especially to be relevant to the sciences of the mind more directly. So I'm interested in, for example, if things go any differently, if one asks, is psychoanalysis relevant, say, to scientific psychology? I mean, I expect if you did your search process on journals in psychology rather than neuroscience, the ratio would be somewhere above 1 in 64,000. So I'm just curious, and really one of the key questions then is whether certain concepts, which come from psychoanalysis, really carry some explanatory weight in scientific psychology. So you think about key concepts from psychoanalysis. I mean, one obviously is the unconscious, and yes, the unconscious carries a lot of explanatory weight in current scientific psychology. On the other hand, it doesn't look very much like the psychoanalytic. The notion of the unconscious that currently gets explanatory weight in scientific psychology isn't terribly much. Doesn't look that much like the dynamic notion, the notion that was distinctive to psychoanalysis. So I don't really count that one as a win for psychoanalysis. What I'm curious about is whether things go differently for other key concepts of psychoanalysis. Perhaps take another key concept like repression. I don't know that much about the current status of repression in scientific psychology, but is there a clear successor notion? It doesn't have to be the same notion, because as Bob was saying, we're not going to use exactly the science of 100 years ago, but is there a clear successor notion, say, of repression that right now carries explanatory weight in scientific psychology that nonetheless captures some of the core of the early psychoanalytic notion? Or if it's not repression, are there other key concepts of psychoanalysis that one can now see carrying that explanatory weight in scientific psychology? I guess that's a question for the defenders.
So I'll start, Christina, and then you take over. The question about psychoanalysis in relation to the sciences of the mind more generally than neuroscience in the narrowest sense. I find it interesting that you ask that question, because your own work, your critique of the limitations of the cognitive science approach and the cognitive neuroscience approach to understanding consciousness, I think coincides exactly with why psychoanalysis is so relevant. What's missing in these mechanistic functionalist accounts, as your own work shows, is precisely what psychoanalysis is about, which is the actual phenomenal lived, what it's like to be a person. And I think that there's an enormous amount that's lost in the science of the mind by not taking seriously this observational perspective and what we can learn by it. There are things that you simply cannot understand about how the mind works if you leave that perspective out of account. And that is the perspective of psychoanalysis. It is a fact of history, that we started there. Psychoanalysis doesn't own that perspective, but it really did champion that perspective. And it's that's been denuded in the sort of mindless psychiatry and sort of proudly mindless psychiatry and cognitive neuroscience of our times. So I think that that's how I'd like to respond to that sort of general question. As regards specific concepts, I'll say just two things and then hand over to Christina. And the first thing I want to say responds also to something that Robert said. It's The concepts, when I studied confabulatory amnesia, which I did in the early 90s, explicitly using psychoanalytical methods and concepts. That was the whole idea. What can we learn by looking at it from this point of view? At the motivational state, the affective state, the subjective experience of the patient, do we learn something new? And I did use psychoanalytical concepts in my understanding of it. The reality principle and the pleasure principle, for example, when the cognitive machinery of veridical reality-constrained memory are broken, then what's released from inhibition is a more affective pleasure principle, wishful type of cognition. I think that's really important, and it helps us to understand better something about how memory works and how those parts of the brain work. So I could go on from that. I'm just pointing the direction of an answer. As regards your last point about repression, oh yes, they are studied empirically today. Mike Anderson and Nikolai Axmacher are outstanding examples, both of them cognitive neuroscientists. The terms that they use are memory suppression and motivated forgetting, and it's an important, it's narrow but important line of research in cognition and memory.
Yeah, I actually totally agree, or at least was my understanding to what you said, that developing sciences of the mind together is the future. I would love to see what can be contributed from psychoanalysis, neuroscience, psychiatry, cognitive science. So this is not just one, neuroscience versus psychoanalysis or vice versa, because it's only in that type of work that steps forward are going to happen, I think. And it's not about definitions. It's not about is repression a correct concept that explains this or that. To me, is how the richness of the material is posed so that it can inspire testable questions. We need to test questions. Nobody, I think, denies that psychoanalysis lacks the testing and the proofs, but it provides the richness of the material to think about and formulate new hypotheses. For example, in many readings, I was very struck by reading about how the memory processes are described in psychoanalysis. And I work on memory. So this was not like a superficial, concept that flew over me. And no doubt, in my view, that in many of those readings, I paused and thought about a number of questions related to memory processes in neuroscience.
Can I say something? So I think it's really important to take subjectivity and the human condition in general into account when we're studying the neural mechanisms of how the brain works. And I think the unconscious is very important. I think things like repression and suppression and dissociation are concepts that came out of the field of psychoanalysis, which we're understanding some of the neural mechanisms of those particular things now. But that doesn't mean that psychoanalysis in general has to be our framework for understanding phenomenology, right? There's a field that Varela was a proponent of, this neurophenomenology, which is taking this subjectivity, exploring it, understanding it, and seeing how it relates to the brain. And I just don't see why psychoanalysis needs to be that framework of the mind when, yes, there are some concepts that have stood the test of time, but there are many others that have not. Penis envy is just one. And then we don't need to be limited. I agree with you. I think that we can take things from a lot of different fields to understand. What I'm seeking is the truth, right? How does the brain work? How does the mind work? And I'm open to anything that bears that we can actually test, that we can see, that we can prove, or else it's just conjecture. And sometimes you can cherry pick evidence for it and find support for it, and sometimes there's real evidence for it. So it's not that everything in psychoanalysis is untrue. It's just that we need to be agnostic when we look at it.
And just, well, no, let's go on. Let's take other questions.
My question is for Christina Albiruni and Mark Solms. So maybe beginning with with Mark's presentation. When you were describing ES and the confabulatory amnesia, you described what initially might have come across as sort of nonsense and garbled reports as actually susceptible to interpretation, and susceptible to interpretation as governed by, some kind of wishful thinking, when you described so vividly the self-reassurances that he gave. And then when you said that psychoanalysis, with its idea of a pleasure principle that regulates some of our thoughts and memories, could provide insight to neuroscience. The insight was supposed to be that confabulatory amnesia has a wishful aspect that might otherwise have been overlooked. And I'm struck by the fact that in other cases of memory, we also find a wishful aspect. So one case that's been discussed a lot is John Dean, the so-called human tape recorder from the Nixon administration, who had such a vivid memory of all these meetings, but unbeknownst to him, he was tape recorded, so you could have a real-life psychology experiment where you compared them, and he got the gist of things right, but he often gave himself a kind of bigger role in the proceedings and stuff. So that just seemed like a kind of real-life, non-pathological case of wishful memory. So that leaves me wondering whether, Mark, you were saying that the insight we get into confabulatory amnesia is that it's actually continuous with other kinds of memory, because we find the pleasure principle or something like it operating both in the pathological case and the non-pathological case, or whether you were saying that we don't find that psychoanalysis is, the initial psychoanalytic claims about the pleasure principle are scaled back so that it's only applying to a pathological case like confabulatory amnesia. And then just more generally for both of you, it strikes me that if we were going to find successor notions to the ones that are in psychoanalysis that could, have some traction experimentally and in the analysis, the scientific analysis of the mind, it might take the form, and one of the forms it might take is a theory of patterns and what we remember and what we forget. So, regular old cognitive science says you forget things that you don't have a lot of external cues for, but maybe the pleasure principle type of theory says that we forget things that are painful to forget, or remember things that are not so painful to remember. So I would find it useful if both of you articulated the sorts of hypotheses that you have about that, of how do we see the pleasure principle operating in memory, across the board between pathological contexts and normal contexts, or do you see it operating only in pathological contexts?
So again, if I'll go first and then hand over to Christina. As regards the continuity or discontinuity between the normal and the pathological, it's a sort of a long-standing tenet of psychoanalysis that there's a continuity between the normal and the pathological. But of course, we had to look at it empirically. In the case of the confabulatory amnesiacs that we've studied, that's why we compare them, first of all, to amnestic controls, in other words, non-confabulating amnestic disorders, and we compared them to misremembering in normal controls. And we showed this gigantic difference. It doesn't mean that there is not that bias in the normal population. There is, and it goes under the heading of something called self-serving bias. And it is demonstrably the case that there's a wishful element in all memory. My point is that tendency is disinhibited when the executive control mechanisms that were impaired in my patient and in all such patients, when those inhibitory mechanisms are impaired, then this normal tendency, which is normally constrained by reality-oriented, more mature cognitive mechanisms, it's released from inhibition. So you see a grossly exaggerated form of something that is present in the normal population. As regards your broader point, I'll hand that over to Christina, but I will link it to some other things that have been said about Otto Loewi, for example. Why do we always cite Freud whenever we're talking about synapses? We don't cite Loewi. I think that the comparison is not on all fours. I think that Freud's role is something like that of Newton in relation to physics, or Darwin in relation to evolutionary biology. He sort of sketched out the sort of broad ballpark, and Newton got a hell of a lot of things fundamentally wrong. And Darwin, Darwin didn't understand anything of the mechanism of inheritance, and so on, let alone its actual molecular vehicles. We don't then say oh, we know, God, we should never talk about Darwin and Newton again. Nor do we say we should no longer call physics physics. We should name it something else because now we have a different understanding of the phenomena. I think that Freud's position is something, it was sketched out a territory in very broad brushstrokes. And our job, I absolutely agree that there's been a shameful lack of experimental work in psychoanalysis, largely because the subject matter of psychoanalysis doesn't lend itself to experiment. But now it does. We have the tools now. And so we're advancing that field. We call it psychoanalysis because that's what it was called initially. And I think that it's a disservice to Freud. And in fact, there's a censorship of the use of that word in the neuroscientific literature, which I don't want to be part of. I want to give credit where it's due. But it's not a matter of proving Freud right or wrong. It's a matter of finishing the job.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. I totally agree with that. It's not about, is Freud correct in every single thing he said? That's really not the point. He's taking the field as a whole and using what is
there like
providing, right? So, for example, I don't know, one can debate about one specific question and what is the field providing in terms of tools to understand new experiments, or even clinically for for approaches to pathologies.
Is there a specific hypothesis about the role of the pleasure principle in memory that you would put forward as an empirical hypothesis about how memory works?
But one will have to dissect the concept into a very specific question. The example I gave was about infantile amnesia. Again, from the definition, then I broke it down into very specific question to be tested. But it was inspired by the concept. So, I mean, we can talk about the specific ones, but this is what I see.
So do you think that your research on memory proves that Freud or supported Freud's theory of infantile?
No, it did not, but that was not the point. So the point is not to support Freud, prove it wrong or right. First, all fields have said things that are right and things that are wrong. It's not just psychoanalysis. Neuroscience, cognitive science, all the fields have published, even tested and concluded things that then were proven wrong and others that continue because were proven right repeatedly. But my point was not to prove Freud right or wrong. It was the inspiration of how to test the question and how to formulate it.
Okay, but we knew about infantile amnesia already. We
Right.
didn't need, Freud didn't really give us much to I mean, you used it. It was important to you. So I'll
It was
leave
important to me also because through the material that I studied, the formulation was based on individual differences that click in the definition of specific question that I started to ask. And of course, we started by asking the most simple one, got to some data, and after seeing that the brain matures in response to experience, the next question we addressed is this maturation happening according to the selective experience? Here we're getting into the individuality, the development of the individuality. And the answer, we tested that, and the answer is actually yes.
Right, but
and this is very much linked to psychoanalytic material.
I mean, it seems to me strange to claim that psychoanalysis can claim ownership to the concept that you have to pay attention to individual differences.
That's not what I said.
Okay. So
Can I just make a general comment too, just related to that, is that it just seems that the definition, like I think spending my whole career being interested in the neural basis of consciousness and unconscious processes, that the study of the life of the mind and understanding it is very important to what we do. I'm not saying that, but I think that the definition of what psychoanalysis is keeps like getting broader and broader, and I'm getting confused. Like even terms like the unconscious, like I said, psychiatrists knew about that before Freud, before psychoanalysis, and on many of these concepts, like dissociation as well. So what we're calling psychoanalysis just seems to be, there's fuzzy boundaries, and I don't see why that's taking credit for all the things when we're studying the life of the mind, which is important. The life of the mind to inform our research and what it is like to have the human experience and individual differences and personality and is all important. But why is it all called psychoanalysis?
And there's a way in which psychoanalysis wants it both ways. I mean, they have very specific definitions. Mark writes his article about whether, Freud said that the ego was conscious and the ego was, I don't know, but he's talking a lot about what Freud says. There's paragraphs and paragraphs quoted from Freud. And then he says, well, we're just using that as a conceptual framework when we talk about repression and how the concept of repression is valuable to neuroscience. We're just talking about not exactly the way Freud defined it because, of course, he didn't have the background, he didn't have the tools yet. So either it's just sort of an I Ching type way of saying things are connected to one another, and repression, suppression, all these concepts are meaningful to neuroscience, or you're talking about specific things. And Mark, you were saying...
Let's go on to the audience.
Okay.
Thank you. This is a question that was elicited in my mind by something Mark said, but of course anyone who would like to say something about it could. So, Mark, you said that the experimental studies of the relative success of cognitive therapies and psychoanalytic therapies were actually not well done because cognitive therapies are much shorter, whereas psychoanalytic therapies are much longer. So if you compare over a given period, of course, the results are not going to be the same. And so I was wondering whether you could say more about why psychoanalytic therapies are much longer, and if there are types of pathologies that are more, for which cognitive therapies would be more relevant, and others for which psychoanalytic therapies would be more relevant, and why, and whether that does relate to different, not only mental, but brain phenomena that are under consideration and being treated. And related question, yes, of course, psychoanalytic therapies have become very long, but Freud treated his rich Viennese women, as Heather said, in a few weeks or a few months, or at most 2 years for the cases we know. So why has it become so long? Is it because it has become just a cultural phenomenon? Anything with comparative literature, you have to do analysis, or is it still the same discipline or clinic? Or anyway, so it's a whole chain of questions about what exactly is being treated specifically in psychoanalysis, and therefore what type of brain phenomenon is being addressed that perhaps is not addressed by those other types of therapies and approaches.
So in the interest of having lots of questions, I'm going to be very brief. Those are what I cited because of the question. These were head-to-head trials. So it's a comparison of like to like. You have to control for dosage effects. And that's why in those comparative CBT psychoanalytical therapy trials, you have to have short-term treatments and infrequent sessions. My point was that is to the detriment of demonstrating the therapeutic efficacy of psychoanalysis, because we believe it needs more frequent and more frequent sessions and longer treatments. And I cited the meta-analysis of those studies. Your question as to why should it be longer, it has everything to do with how non-declarative memory systems work, what we in psychoanalysis call the unconscious. You know, in cognitive neuroscience, we say that this type of memory, especially procedural non-declarative memory, it's hard to learn and hard to forget. You know, it's a slow business becoming who you are. There's no reason to believe that you can unbecome who you are quickly. But the question as to which disorders are best treated by psychoanalysis and which by CBT and other psychotherapies, I think is an open and important question, because I don't think everyone needs psychoanalysis. And I think that the future is going to tell us much more in regard to the question you raised than we know today.
Mark, how many sessions do you think is necessary for the average psychoanalytic patient?
Well, as I say, I think this is an open question that's in need of far more research. There's no such thing as the average psychoanalytic
Well,
patient.
so what would you what do you think is the median number of sessions that a patient has in who's in psychoanalysis?
I'm really not sure what you're asking, Robert. I mean,
Well, okay, if you're doing EMDR treatment, you do 3 sessions if it's an acute case. If it's early childhood trauma, it might run 100, 200 sessions over 2 to 5 years. There's obviously an average number. There's obviously a median number of how many sessions the average psychoanalytic patient has. I mean, that's got to be out there in the literature, I would hope.
I mean, when we're doing randomized controlled trials,
No, I'm not talking on clinical practice.
Yeah, so in clinical practice, it's really not something that we know. It widely varies. There's psychoanalytical psychotherapies which are once a week for a year. There's psychoanalytic psychotherapies which are 5 times a week for 10 years, and everything in between.
I'm a neuroscientist, but critical of neuroscience. And I think one of the criticisms of neuroscience is that it's too computational. Computational modelings do wonderful things, but I think they fail exactly in the areas that Mark Solms is talking about. They don't do
Yeah, it's working.
They don't do a good job in terms of motivation, emotion, energy levels, all sorts of things. And I think in Freud's era, there was no concept of computation, of a computational approach. So it's a wonderful new approach, but my sense is it's missing a lot of stuff. So comments.
Yeah, Thomas Kuhn in his The Nature of Scientific Revolution talks about the difference between clinical researchers and basic scientists, so neuroscientists versus, for example, psychiatrists of one stripe or another. Kuhn says that neuroscientists or basic scientists take the knowledge they have and try to imagine how they can add a little bit to what they know based on what they already know. And so it's an incremental science that grows out from its base and grows slowly. He says if you're a clinical scientist, you have a problem. You've got a problem like psychosis, and you can't wait for basic scientists to catch up to you. And so you do a very different type of research. Kuhn sort of in fun said that basic scientists, you can imagine, are doing a jigsaw puzzle. And clinical scientists are mixing 2 jigsaw puzzles and trying to put them together. He says it's
More than pathology, things like emotion.
So the answer is that there's a whole field of affective neuroscience now that's growing up. It was dissed early on. It was thought to be different. I don't think it's any different than cognitive neurosciences. I think they're branches of the exact same field, but we grow at the rate that we can. And I don't think there's any neuroscientist who doesn't think that the goal of neuroscience is to understand repression and childhood trauma and all of these concepts that psychoanalysis attempts to deal with. It just doesn't feel that at the moment, that you can get from A to Z without going through the letters in between.
Yeah, I think the question that's being raised here implicitly is why we're still arguing about Freud after all this time. Freud's been viciously attacked since the beginning of the 20th century, and people are still attacking him, and yet there are still conferences at places like NYU in which people defend Freud. So I just want to give you my pet theory for why this is so and get your reactions. It seems to me that Freud at least had this big, ambitious, comprehensive theory that was obviously flawed, but it's only going to be displaced if something comes along that's definitely better as a theory and as a treatment for mental disorders, and we don't have that. So I guess the major paradigm these days is some kind of neurochemical paradigm that supports the drug treatments for mental illness and supposedly explains the various disorders. And that paradigm is really wobbly. It's just not working very well. And as a result, and the same is true of, evolutionary psychology or behaviorism or anything else you can mention. And so that's why we're still kicking Freud around, just because nothing has replaced him. So I just want to get your comments on that.
My answer is brief, I agree.
Me too. Yeah, that's exactly the point. Yeah.
Can I just say something about that? So, I like Darwin, Newton, who you mentioned, as the sort of founders of these schools of thought that set the field in motion, and then there was many experiments done along the way that refined these fields, whether in physics or evolutionary biology. Freud talked about things at the time which were radical, and it was it shifted the whole field of psychiatry, and I think that was really important, right? But if you're now in this day and age right now where the field, neuroscience is a huge field. Some people are just studying molecular and physical aspects of neurons, but for people in the areas of cognitive neuroscience or affective neuroscience, we're really trying to understand the relationship between the physical brain and the mind, and in order to do that you need to have a good working model of the mind. And as I said, and I'll repeat, although psychoanalysis, there's some interesting things that we can pull out of it that are curious, and maybe that relates to how the mind works. But as a whole, we don't need that as the framework for our research to make connections between the physical brain and the mind. Psychoanalysis, again, clinically speaking, might have some efficacy and relevance, but it's almost like spirituality. I'm saying, I'm not saying that, I'm saying that it does. People find solace in religion, people find healing in belief systems and in spirituality, and whether it's valid or not, it's therapeutic. Okay, and I think that that gives it some legitimacy. And with psychoanalysis, until we have really clear experimental validation of it, we don't know if it's valid or not, but it might have efficacy the way that spirituality and religion and belief systems have. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying, as a scientist who's seeking truth, how does the physical brain and the mind really relate, and how does the mind work? I want things that I can test so that it can. Because there are a lot of people who have different theories. When we talk about the neural basis of consciousness, there's theories of integrated information theory. It's interesting, but the only way to know for sure is we need to be able to test it.
And 2 points. Mark, you mentioned Newton and Darwin. We don't have conferences like this where people get up and say, Newton was right, Newton is relevant, or Newton was wrong, Newton is irrelevant. To a scientist, that's a goofy kind of a thing to even think about. And the same thing with evolution. There's a lot of things unexplained in evolution. There's a lot of problems with evolution. And we don't say, Darwin, if you paid attention to Darwin, you would understand all these things. Darwin said in this book on page this, I'll quote what he said to you. Nobody does that.
Actually, that happens all the time.
And then bad for them, okay? Equally bad for them. I used to think that poor Darwin got a bad rap, that he wasn't such a bad guy. He was trying to write about something where the scientific basis just wasn't there yet. And that after he wrote, he somehow became raised to almost a God figure, where what he said seemed to be absolutely true, and it wasn't fair to blame Freud for it. It was his followers who put him in that bad position. But then I realized that, in fact, Freud was pretty adamant that if you disagreed with him on this or disagreed with him on that, you were out. It was almost like a Protestant revolution if you disagreed with Freud. And so I think he owns some of that. So he has created an audience here where people will say, no, 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 out in the audience,
So I want to humbly speak for the clinicians in the room. I've been a practitioner for 35 years, psychodynamic psychotherapist, and what this discussion, one thing I'm taking from this is how important it is for neuroscientists to talk to clinicians. I feel like some of what you've said has devalued the knowledge that we have from years and years of seeking truth in our way. And to refer to what we do as non-scientific and as conjecture is insulting. And I say that not in a way to try to promote this conversation. I think it's really important that I'm a practitioner who has fallen in love with neuroscience. I'd love to see it go in the other direction.
Can I just, I'm a neuroscientist and a trained clinician as well. So after spending years as a cognitive neuroscientist, went back to respecialize in clinical psychology, but also with a psychoanalytic, perspective. Okay, so I'm not trying to diss psychoanalysis, and I think I've said it repeatedly. I think that there is some clinical, there is value there to some of the methods. I'm just saying that in relevance to my life as a neuroscientist, and I can see both sides, that it doesn't, when I'm doing my neuroscience research, the knowledge I have from this field, as I said, some things, that are interesting that I can apply, but in general, this field of neuroscience isn't reliant on psychoanalytic theory. But psychoanalytic theory, I think, does have some value, and clinically speaking. So I'm not trying to diss it. And I didn't come to sort of tear it down. I'm just talking about how relevant it is to what we do.
Yeah, and I need to say my wife is a clinical psychologist. She works with early childhood trauma, day in and day out. That's her specialty. She's right now finishing up a 4-hour workshop before the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation up in Boston. It's a good marriage. It works. We respect each other.
And now we have a Freudian explanation of all of your views.
Yeah.
That's right. The question was the relevance, and we have, she's mad at me because I don't do research on DID, which I've actually been toying with some grant proposals for, but the question was the relevance of psychoanalysis, not the relevance of psychology and psychological. I mean, there's 20 different models for the treatment of psychological disorders. She happens to be an EMDR specialist, but she does mostly trauma. There's all sorts, and I think they all contribute. My complaint about psychoanalysis is its refusal to define its concepts well enough that a neuroscientist knows what to do with it if they want to study it. I don't know what repression is, and that picture you put up on the screen.
So I'd like to make a very general remark. I know we're heading toward the end. I think it's very important that we must remember that in scientific psychology, by which I mean academic psychology, psychoanalysis was ruled out of court, early on in the 20th century as behaviorism took over. And by psychoanalysis, I mean the very things that we're talking about. Subjectivity, the internal lived life of the mind was excluded from experimental psychology. I mean, the mind was left out of psychology. It's really astonishing. And I think that's the reason why people, neuroscientists like me and Cristina, felt the need to train in psychoanalysis when we wanted to bring that stuff back into neuroscience. We had to go back to psychoanalysis, this old thing, because it's all there was. And now we're bringing it into neuroscience in order to take it forwards. That aspect, the lived life of the mind, needs to find its place in the family of neurosciences, and I think it'll be for the
and
to
nobody
the better
disagrees
for all
with
of
that.
us.
So this might be a pretty good last question because it's about evidence. So you've all made it pretty clear, some of you more attitudinally than propositionally, where you stand on this question about the relevance of psychoanalysis to neuroscience. I wonder what each of you think about the direction of the evidence on this question. So if this meeting were held 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago, do you think the case would have been weaker or stronger for the relevance of psychoanalysis? Is there some direction to your thinking about the relevance?
Well, I've been at this for 33 years, and I've been at many meetings like this, and I think the evidence gets stronger.
Curious. As I try to think about it, I feel that as neuroscience matures as a field from something that studied single neurons to something that studies organisms and interactions between organisms, and as cognitive neuroscience finally, belatedly agrees that affective neuroscience is as important as cognitive neuroscience, and the very young say, in fact, there's no difference between the two, I think psychoanalysis has even less to offer than it did 10 or 20 years ago. I think neuroscience gets it, and it got it without using psychoanalysis.
I think this is very revealing of something.
So, the previous speaker labeled his question the last, but that was premature. So I've been, I'm a practicing psychiatrist. I happen to have been present at the moment when Mort Reiser came up with the phrase, "We're going from a brainless psychiatry to a mindless psychiatry," when he came up with that 35 years ago. It seems to me that one of the reasons that this conversation goes in a circle is that the impact of Freudian thought has been so powerful on actually every man's language that we are so embedded that it goes to the old phrase of a fish doesn't know it's wet. We are so embedded in that language that I don't think there's a single neuroscientist who takes into account fully the fact that their very thinking from a very early age is embedded with psychoanalytic concepts because it was so transformational. So I would put forth the thesis that what is modern day folk psychology is actually very much embedded with psychoanalytic concepts, and it's hard to sort it out.
So then psychoanalysis has had a profound effect on neuroscience, but that's it. It's done. It doesn't have more to add.
I mean, can I just refer to the question about your question of the progress? I'm someone, I almost feel like a traitor because I've been involved with the neuropsychoanalysis movement. I'm always interested in integrating the fields. I think it's important. And I think we all sit here in our little, boxes. I mean, we can't get 5 PhDs, right? So you specialize in one thing. You do neuroscience, you do psychology, or you become an analyst, or sometimes you do both, like many of us up here who are double specialized in different things. So we can see the interconnections between these fields. So I do think that the real full answer, like I said, I'm seeking the truth, is going to come a little bit from everywhere, right? All the answers aren't going to come from neuroscience or from psychoanalysis or psychology. It's going to be a mix. What I'm skeptical of is the complete reliance on just one perspective. And I don't think that that's where all the truth lies in any field. It's equally true of neuroscience. And so only by integrating them and finding and being willing to say, yes, you know what, that bears truth. But that stuff, so not everything Freud said was true. Some stuff he got right. There's others that were wrong, and we can throw that out. And so this blind sort of like almost religious like belief in these ideas and theories that are not being tested, that's what I'm opposed to. Not psychoanalysis as a whole, but let's just take what works from all the fields and combine them for a real answer.
A good end.
Anybody else want to comment on that?